Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our webinar here on bail reform. I guess I've been calling it a post-mortem in the back of my mind. My name is Hamad-Lipscombe. I'm the Executive Director of Envision Freedom Fund. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in 1 minute. But first, I wanted to give a little context as to why we're here. First, in case you haven't heard of us, Envision Freedom Fund works alongside impacted communities to transform the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. With freedom as our guiding principle, we invest in campaigns and programs with the aim of winning long-term transformative change while also meeting those urgent, critical needs that community members have right now in the present. As some of you know, we started as a community bail fund. We were the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. In our early years, we paid bail for nearly 5,000 New Yorkers, helping free them from Rikers and other jails in the city so that they could have access to due process, all while maintaining their jobs, their housing, their healthcare, their children, not to mention their lives. And that strategy worked for a while. But as some of you also know, we no longer pay bail. In fact, we stopped paying bail operations for criminal cases in 2020 after the seminal bail reform bill passed in New York State and went into effect. For us, there were several reasons we stopped paying bail. The biggest was that under the law that established us, the New York Charitable Bail Act, it prevented bail funds from bailing people out that were charged with felonies or sex-related misdemeanors and had bail more than $2,000. The bail reform law of 2020, though, thankfully, in its initial incarnation, ensured pretrial liberty without bail for most New Yorkers charged with misdemeanors, leaving most people, or many people, facing pretrial detention today, either with a felony charge or with a bail amount exceeding $2,000. Out of the population bail funds are permitted to help. The legislature tried to change the restrictions to allow for bail funds to be able to free more of those folks, but Governor Cuomo vetoed the bill. So here we are in 2023 with bail amounts that are now averaging well above $2,000, especially in New York City. We've had 3 rounds of rollbacks to the bail reform law that have given judges increasingly more discretion and cover to send more people than initially established to jails, which we'll get into later. And thus we see higher jail populations, particularly at Rikers Island, which, as we've seen in recent reports, is really becoming deadly. So to be direct, many of us advocates, including ourselves at Envision Freedom, we were betting on the success of bail reform and less so on sustaining ourselves as bail funds. We thought that once bail reform passed, we were on our way to putting ourselves out of business. We believed that if we could make the case that cash bail was obsolete, then New York would surely get it and would surely eliminate cash bail. And we made that case. We saw thousands of success stories of families united, of people that were able to keep their jobs, and so forth. Our client appearance rate was 95%. This was the reality that we wanted all of New York to experience. But that brings us to today. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, how many nights I'm up grappling with how we continue to meet the critical needs of communities disproportionately targeted by incarceration, while also being under attack. Bail reform was attacked before it was even implemented. Before one judge looked at the bail reform law, bail reform was attacked. And so how do we keep meeting those critical needs of communities while also defending the gains we've made and pushing for more? We believe our fight since 2020 to protect bail reform wasn't in vain, and we know that it's part of a bigger fight for pretrial liberty. So we've convened this webinar and this amazing panel to do 3 things. First, to reflect on the 3 rounds of rollbacks and their outcomes to bail reform. Second, to share our respective roles in the fight for pretrial justice, and how you can support and how we plan to continue really, and to discuss how we must continue to fight and how. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Assembly Member Latrice Walker, representing the 55th Assembly District, where she's a member of, on the Assembly, she's a member of the Election Law Committee, as well as the Housing, Judiciary, Codes, and Ways and Means Committees. And Assembly Member Walker not only has a strong record in Albany fighting for progressive change, including as one of the most vocal champions for bail reform, but also in her community around issues like affordable housing and tenants' rights and stop and frisk. So she's been in this fight before bail reform, before, taking on, moving to Albany and representing us there. She was the engine behind the 2019 bail reform laws. And when recent rollbacks were proposed near the end of the budget process earlier this year, Assembly Member Walker went on a hunger strike for 19 days in protest. We also have Amanda Jack, or AJ. AJ is a public defender and policy attorney at Legal Aid Society, who works with New Yorkers directly impacted by changes to bail laws, who's also been involved in this fight to end cash bail and pretrial detention for well over a decade in New York State. And lastly, we have Zoë Adel Perry. Zoë is Envision Freedom Fund's Research and Advocacy Manager. She's been researching, monitoring, and tracking bail reform at the organization and citywide since before bail reform, and has continued to shed light on the systemic injustices of pretrial detention. So with that, welcome panelists. And I'm gonna jump right in with questions. And my first question is for you, Assembly Member Walker. As you were as Assembly Member, in many ways, you were the legislative architect and the state's biggest champion of the bail reform law, leading the push in Albany to get it passed, and then afterwards leading the post-passage fight each year to keep it law, to make sure that it stayed on the books. Each budget cycle since 2019, there seems to have been an incredible amount of focus on bail reform. Some reporters have described budget discussions hinging on this issue alone. How have you seen the rollbacks passed and, frankly, the air in Albany sucked up by bail reform affect the progress we made in 2019? What has been at stake to you with these discussions? And what is it that Albany lawmakers just don't seem to be getting?
Wow. So hello, everyone. I am Latrice Walker. And, I guess part of my history is that, I'm a little girl who grew up in public housing and who, had a dream of being an attorney. And so by virtue of my community DNA, being from Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the nation's billion-dollar blocks, which sends countless numbers of individuals through the criminal justice system each and every day, it was just, a no-brainer for me to find myself in this position. I'm also a bit of a history buff and have been looking at reparations, of course, and the effects of slavery and the sort of iterations of slavery throughout society, even through present day. And we know that the criminal justice system is the biggest representation of chattel slavery that, we've seen. And quite frankly, it's been as pervasive and as longstanding. And one of the things that we knew was that pretrial incarceration was sending people to a death trap, as you mentioned. There have been countless numbers of deaths that have happened on Rikers Island. Of course, one of the most notorious was that of Khalif Browder's, but I have a cousin who also died on Rikers Island. And so the story was real for me. And so it invigorated my fight in Albany. And it wasn't as difficult, in the beginning of time when bail reform was initially introduced. Many of my colleagues saw that the issues that people were bartering, having to pay their rent or buy their groceries or purchase medication in order to post bail for their loved ones. And we knew it was one of the biggest injustices based on poverty that we've seen as a city and as a state, and that something had to be done about it. At the time, we had a gubernatorial administration who was open to the idea. We've changed the dynamics in the Senate so that it was a Democrat-controlled Senate. And then also we know that in the Assembly, all of us were Democrats for the most part. And the sort of politics were in line for some of the most instrumental criminal justice reforms that our state has saw in over 50 years. And we knew that the time was right to be able to do it. And of course, bail reform had cousins, and in order for us to do it, we had to do speedy trial, and we had to also do discovery reform. And so the climate for getting the bill, which had been done to be placed into the budget, was about the advocacy of a collective group. Of course, there were a number of caucus members. I believe there were at the time anywhere between 50 and 60 caucus members. Our numbers have grown, so I don't remember the exact number. And through the advocacy of all of these different groups, we were able to have bail reform. And we eliminated cash bail for misdemeanors and most nonviolent felonies. And we were seeing the progress sort of coming of age, not in a real way, as you mentioned, because the law had not been implemented, but the spirit of the law was still in place. And so we were seeing judges who were still becoming more acquiescent to the fact that these changes needed to happen. And it was a groundswell coming out of the city council. And so we just knew that we had hit that moment. And then the media began to play a role. And most of what we were seeing was that a lot of the challenges to bail reform, which were coming out of the district attorney associations. Of course, as you know, this was a national conversation. And so bail reform was happening in other states around the country. And some of them were utilizing a dangerousness standard, which New York State had never had. And so that was the core of what we wanted to hold on to. Even though under many different governors over many different decades, this conversation about bail and dangerousness had come up, we always continue to hold true to the fact that bail was about ensuring someone's return to court. And again, when posting bail or not posting bail is sort of the entryway into Rikers Island, and of course the entranceway into our state correctional facilities. Into losing constitutional rights to vote, working for pennies each and every day, and again the iteration of slavery in the modern day times. And when we were sort of liberating folk from bail, we were sort of cutting off the floodgates from opening up to this system. And the advocacy groups hit the media. Was able to perpetuate the misinformation into society. Many of my colleagues, through the advocacy, whether it was their community or many of these other groups, were beginning to believe in many of the misinformation that was being told to them. And so folk who were at one point, staunch allies of criminal justice reform and bail reform were no longer that way. And many of them even were beginning to advocate for many of the changes, or just becoming more acquiescent to the changes. And it became a political nightmare. And however, we know that we were winning on the policies because we saw what was happening in court. We saw that people were being connected to housing, jobs, resources, and their families were being maintained. But that story just never rang true. And so we saw the changes that came up in 2019, again in 2020, then again in 2022, and most recently in 2023. And I was on 2 hunger strikes, first in 2022 for I believe about 21 days, and then again this year. And the last one, we were successful in them not changing the standard with respect to the most restrictive means test in order to ensure a person's return to court. And this year, we weren't as successful, and it appears that the agenda that folk had to roll back bail reform and to take us to a place that we had never been in bail in our state, they tried their best to be successful, but our resilience was able to show through. And so we're dependent on people, of course, like the amazing Amanda Jack and her colleagues to be able to ensure that the rights that we have changed for people are able to be realized.
Thanks so much, Assembly Member. Zoe, you've done extensive research on the outcomes of bail reform since it passed in 2019 and went into effect in 2020, not to mention what the system looked like before the laws changed when we at Envision Freedom Fund was operating as a bail fund. Before we get into the effects of the rollbacks, in what ways has bail reform law advanced pretrial liberty and brought us closer to what we believe should be a reality for New Yorkers? I know the Assembly members started to touch on that, but could you elaborate a bit more, Zoe?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll first start just by saying that I think above all, the fight for bail reform was one for freedom and fairness and safety, especially for the communities most impacted, Black, Brown, and low-income communities. And in the first few months of bail reform, we saw these goals realized. We saw more freedom for people in New York. We saw more fairness. We saw more safety because people were able to go home. In just the first few months of 2020, when bail reform was implemented, it was implemented actually in late 2019 as judges started releasing people before the laws went into effect. So by early 2020, we saw the jail population cut by nearly half. Bail setting rates went way down. Judges, instead of setting bail on, I think, 25% of cases, which they were doing before bail reform, that dropped to 8% right at the onset of bail reform implementation. So this really meant that thousands and thousands of New Yorkers who otherwise would have been in jail were able to go home, keep their jobs, their housing, their access to services like mental health care, substance use treatment. And on top of that, there have been since then a ton of studies that have come out showing what we knew to be true, which was that reducing the use of bail is good for community safety in all the ways that I just mentioned, by connecting people with the things that I think we all can agree increase safety in our communities, like housing and education. And it also showed that, with bail reform, the rearrest rates in New York either largely stayed the same or they actually went down. So that's a lot of what we were seeing in the early days of bail reform. I know we touched on a little bit the rollbacks that came just a few months later. And since then, we've seen 3 rounds of rollbacks, increased arrests, issues with judges, frankly, not implementing the law properly. So we have seen an increase in the jail population as a result, increase in bail setting. Releases have gone down. And, while I think it's still very much true that the jail population and bail setting rates are still better than they were before bail reform, we, I think, need to be honest also about the fact that we still need to be having these conversations like we're doing right now about, all the things that we were fighting for leading up to bail reform are still impacting our communities, and that the fight is very much not over.
Thanks, Zoe. AJ, so you have this unique vantage point as a legal service provider, like as a public defender that's actually in court, seeing how this plays out, and also a policy attorney who has actually lobbied for bail reform law to help ensure access to due process for many of your clients at Legal Aid Society. Can you give us an idea of how this law has changed with each rollback, including the latest one from this past year?
Yes, thanks, Carl, and thanks for having me. Absolutely, and I just also want to start by shouting out Assemblywoman Walker, who it really cannot be said enough what a champion she is for the reform, and it's just the example of someone who stands by legislation and what's right and the moral high ground. And I always try to take every possible opportunity to make sure that's understood and to say public thank you, because it really is punishing work, especially when you come from communities that have been most affected by carceral policies that, yes, extend back to slavery. So I'm going to try to give everyone a 3-minute summary of these rollbacks. This literally could be a whole presentation for a couple of hours. And I'm going to shout out, Legal Aid has an amazing group of attorneys in the decarceration team that are always distilling this and giving the back-to-back feedback. Their leader, Ariel Reed, can literally recite these statutes in a way that probably suggests the need for a vacation. But what I'll say is what happened in the 2019 reforms is that what was finally codified was a constitutional principle that Assemblywoman Walker referenced, which is the least restrictive standard. And so pre-2020, the bail law said the court must consider the kind and degree of control or restriction necessary to secure his court attendance when required. So that's also important because that told us that the purpose of bail is not an assessment of dangerousness, but the purpose of bail is to assure your appearance at your court dates, right? And so the purpose of bail, I'll just highlight throughout, has remained unchanged, as Assemblywoman Walker said, and that's thanks to her leadership and to the zealous advocacy of so many impacted leaders and their families. So in the 2019 laws that went into effect January 1st, 2020, codified what I said was the least restrictive kind and degree of control. So it said that not only is it what is necessary to assure return to court, but it has to be the least restrictive, which means that if someone released on their own recognizance will come back to court, that's it, full stop. Nothing more is needed. If perhaps a supervised release program where they are contacted by social workers and maybe linked up with extra services they might need, or even just given a court reminder to get back to court, that's it. That's all the judge should set. So these effects went, the laws of course went into effect in January 1st, 2020. I was working arraignments New Year's Eve, 2019. So when the clock struck 12, the judges were effectively already doing the implementation in Manhattan, but it was a big moment. It was really a big moment, especially a decade into practice. It was really a hugely impactful change. But unfortunately, the pandemic started about 3 months after that. And just a month after that, in the budget process, when then Governor Cuomo was in charge in the governor's house, the first rollbacks happened. So the first rollbacks did not change the least restrictive means standard, did not change the purpose of bail, did not change the factors. The factors were kind of tweaked in the 2019 laws more than we need to get into now. But what it did do was it added over 30 new misdemeanor and nonviolent felony offenses. And this is important because as Carl said in the beginning, the 2019 bail reforms said that you could not set bail on almost all misdemeanor offenses. It said you could not set bail on most nonviolent felony offenses. And it really changed the game because apart from fairness and equity and access and not languishing in the death trap of the jails in New York City that are Rikers Islands, in the death trap jails across our state, it also changes the outcome of a criminal case, right? We all know the prosecutors have an inordinate amount of power in charging decisions. And if you're incarcerated, you are more than likely going to take a plea to get out of that situation if one is offered to you, which is why across the state, about 98% of cases end in plea agreements and in convictions. They don't go to trial. Most of what I do as a public defender is not trials, but is actually going back and forth to try to get the best deal for the person I represent, right? So the other thing that happened in those 2020 rollbacks, something that we've come to call harm plus harm. And this is really, I think, the through line of what's kind of become the most dangerous, complete like regression year after year with the rollbacks. It said that if someone was rearrested on a felony or a Class A misdemeanor that involved harm to person or property while released on a prior felony or Class A misdemeanor, then they would become eligible for bail. So this is really where the big chipping away started happening. Back and during those rollbacks, A.M. Walker called this out, advocates called this out. We said, this is just reincarcerating people. This is net widening in a huge way, net widening 3 months in to the bail reforms, but yet it happened. And so that was a huge change in 2020. In 2022, the harm plus harm provision, the major change was that the harm plus harm provision was expanded to include theft of property. And I urge you to go watch Assemblywoman Walker's speech on the floor in her no vote on that budget vote, because she called it out. Like it was about using a bludgeon, a hammer again, about expanding something only to put more people in jail and only to put people who couldn't afford the basic necessities of life in jail. So that and part of that too is there was supposed to be an exception for anything that was negligible, right? For the items that, so like diapers, right, formula, milk, things that are crimes of poverty, which this legislature had rightly said in 2019 should no longer be punished by sitting in jail. But I will tell you, sitting here today at the Legal Aid Society, we have a case where someone is accused of stealing socks, which were recovered and returned to the store, and is sitting in on bail, right? So this has had a huge effect, a huge through line. And then, of course, we fought it again this year. And this year, it took a little longer. We really did. As Assembly Member Walker said, we put up a fight. And there was an attempt to claw into the dangerousness territory to say that a judge can sit in that 5-minute, sometimes arraignment situation and determine someone's dangerousness, which we know is a proxy for race. That's all it is, full stop. Study after study shows that. We beat that back. That did not happen. And what did happen was the return to court stayed the same. And the language went back to the pre-2019 language, which is the kind and degree of control necessary to ensure principals return to court. There have been some other changes throughout, but I would say that the harm plus harm has probably been the biggest thing that's happened, and the addition of new qualifying offenses is what we call them. There were some other changes this year that made it so, again, on rearrests, it changed the ways that you can ask for bail if someone's already out on another arrest. So there's all kinds of nuanced changes that have happened every time. And one of the difficulties is that with changes every year in the budget process, a lot of these things that need to be further interpreted through the courts can't even work their way up until they're changed again. So that's been a real problem too, as part of the impetus for the governor insisting on bail changes these last 2 years has been clarity for the judges. And it's quite difficult to claim that your mission is one of clarity when the continual changes make things just more muddied and less clear. And when there's confusion in a criminal court setting, what ends up happening, what we see over and over, is judges don't err on the side of freedom, they err on the side of incarceration. And that's why, as Zoe said, we've seen the populations continue to increase.
Thanks so much, AJ. When I hear these stories of what happens in criminal court, it makes me just so happy that I'm no longer a public defender, because I can't stomach it.
We miss you though, Carol.
Thank you. Assembly Member Walker, sir, your role has been critical in this fight to protect bail reform. And it's different from trying to make sure, the right number of votes are whipped to pass a bill. Some legislators have told us advocates to spend less time in Albany and focus on their districts and try to change the opinions of their constituents. Basically, they've told us to go out and organize their constituents with the assumption that they themselves as legislators get it and understand the benefits of bail reform. As we look at this like inside versus outside game, how do you see your role in protecting bail reform in Albany? And what is there left to do to change the minds of legislators so more of your colleagues really take ownership of the bail reform law and end this cycle of rollbacks via budget negotiations?
Wow, man, you have some really great questions. So I will say that, just to sort of piggyback off of AJ's response, I know she, Volker keeps saying it's like the pre-2019 standard, but I like to say that it's the standard from, what was it, maybe 1964 1964, I believe, was when the original bail statute was set. And so we didn't go pre-2019. We went to 1964. And so again, it talks about, like the politics of what people were saying. We want to take America back. And everyone was like, well, take America back to what? And I think every day that when we're seeing what's happening to female reproductive rights, what we're seeing that's happening with voting rights, how we're seeing districts are being gerrymandered and redrawn across the country, and of course, criminal justice are all indicative of what exactly they wanted to take America back to. And I guess is, the 60s or even beforehand. But at least I guess I'm rebooting my daughter's MacBook, and there's like a timeline or a time warp or something that you can kind of press a button and return back to. And I feel like sort of that's where we are. And how do we sort of sound the alarm amongst my colleagues? And of course, all politics are local. And so, Carl, I would definitely agree that there is a bit of organizing and tapping into on the ground that is required. Folk have to recognize that 19 people dying on Rikers Island and the Department of Justice saying that we need a federal monitor here, that those are not anecdotal sort of changes. Like those came because there are real serious and egregious circumstances that folk are with. When we just made a recent visit to Rikers Island, there was a fire that was set to alarm many of the legislators who were there, like, keep up your fight because it's unbearable behind these walls. And we were closed off from going in and visiting many people who are sitting vulnerable on that island. And now, mind you, right, the storyline that people will put up for us is just because I say, okay, well, they're vulnerable people. They were vulnerable before they got to Rikers Island. They were vulnerable when they were sitting in kindergarten in communities where access to quality education and healthcare and housing just was never something that was afforded to them. And so they are victims of their circumstances. And as we've seen in A Tale of Two Cities, as again, my daughter is reading, we notice that when people have their backs up against the wall and they're trying to find a way to feed themselves and their families, that they will resort to things that are not sometimes in their best interest or the best interest of their community, just to be able to cure the hunger pains that I know very well that they may be going through. And so yes, these are folk who deserve to have the same constitutional rights afforded to them. They are 9 times out of 10 only accused of a crime and have not been convicted of anything. And if there's anything that we believe in these United States, is the fact that you are innocent until proven guilty. But however, and that you should be afforded and adjudicated in a trial where your rights are respected. But most people became of the assumption that your adjudication has to take place at your bail, at your arraignment. And because you are charged with this particular crime, you need to be incarcerated. And one of the things I heard Zoe say about the amount of bail that people are receiving, there was a case recently where someone received $2 million in bail. Right. And I thought that was like so insulting, because sometimes you have to ask yourself as a judge the question, can I do this or should I do this? Right. And so that judge could have just as easily remanded the person. But I believe that, again, they're trying to send a message to people about the necessity of bail. Like we had to put a $2 million bail on this individual, which did not have to be the case. Bail reform gave judges more tools in their toolbox than they had before. And one of the things that we recognize in terms of these tools very early on was in this case of like the Brownsville Safety Alliance. And so one of the things that we did here, it was on the New York cover of the New York Times, and I was very excited about that. But basically, we just took bail reform, the 2019 bail reform laws, and activated those things in the streets of Brooklyn. And so people, one of the most dangerous sort of corners, at least in my district where crime is ridden. We brought housing advocates, housing providers, city and state agencies, the district attorney's office. We partnered with the police department, where there was we had a great inspector at the time who while was all about public safety, but also recognizes that the safest communities have the most resources, not the most policing. And one of the things that we saw was that people who had substance abuse issues were being connected to substance abuse service providers. People who were facing eviction were connected with housing organizations that would provide them resources to keep their families together. People who were facing ACS cases were being connected to family supportive services that were, again, working to help with parenting. And all in all, in this area where we saw that, the police are called, sort of ad nauseum, that there was one police interaction in that area, and it was probably about over a week time period, was because a bus driver made a mistake and pressed the call button on the bus, alerting the police, but there was no reason to call them. And then even when there were circumstances that, folk were fighting, we made huge investments in our cure violence organizations who sort of are credible messengers and violence interrupters. And so if there was a fight or something that may have been happening, an argument that they saw, they responded in real time. And so the police officers, however, were sort of on the peripherals. They were there if necessary, but what we saw was that there was no necessity for them to interact, because as a community, we were able to address the real drivers of crime, which of course is poverty and connectedness to resources that that the community needed. And so that's bail reform, right? And so one day I had an opportunity to be in court and watch a judge in their deliberations as I was standing before them, and there was a group who was a community-based organization who had a desk at arraignment. As soon as that person was arraigned, they were connected to this particular agency, and they were required to follow up. And there were consequences if you did not follow up in those circumstances. So now we're back to a situation where people are being sent straight to Rikers Island as opposed to being connected to all of these essential tools. And so these are the things that we will have to push and stress to our colleagues in these very critical off-session moments, because they are coming back. They want to see a dangerousness standard in some way, shape, fashion, or form in New York. New York is one of the only states that does not have that, continues to hold return to court as the purpose for bail. And so they kept saying, well, why can't we do what New Jersey is doing? Why can't we do what was happening in Chicago? Why can't we do what's happening in all these other places? And New York has to continue to lead the way. So we must continue with our resilience. We must go into our communities to talk about the advances that were made in bail reform. Because each and every year I'm like, the fight is not over. Like, we can't rest on the laurels of success or defeat, depending on how you want to look at it, because they are going to come back again next year. Notwithstanding, we've had a number of our leaders say that they're not going to touch bail reform this year, because we've heard that each and every year. And quite frankly, it just has not been the case. And so there's been a groundswell of support that have been coming out for bail reform, but we've seen some of our closest allies, like for instance, the National Action Network and the NAACP, also begin to question the tenets and the successes of bail reform, even though we have shown them study after study after study that what they are hinging on is purely rhetoric and has no factual basis in the truth. And so we have to continue pushing this message. And so these types of webinars will continue to be important and effective. We have to get with many of our civic organizations in order for them to also understand the benefits of bail reform. And we have to do this from Brooklyn to Buffalo, from Saratoga Avenue to Saratoga, New York, right? And that becomes how it is that we're able to put up this fight. Because one of the things that I saw that was happening was the conversation around bail reform was clogging, other criminal justice reforms that we needed to get done. And quite frankly, what we saw that was happening was, okay, we'll give up these things on bail reform, but then we'll pass these other things that you want. And one of the things that I learned is that they may pass it today, but tomorrow they will begin chipping at the bit, and then we'll see even those things begin to roll themselves back. And so we cannot operate in these sort of silos. Our elected officials have to remain in one accord. We have to support our organizations and the advocacy and the work that gets done there. And we have to do everything it is in our power in order to make sure that we are lifting up the success stories of criminal justice reform, so that they won't, try to kick us back. We got to defend discovery reform because every year they're coming for it. We know what the script is. They give it to us each and every year. And then again, we have to start back from square one because we think that we've already, successfully beat this back. But we know that their advocacy is pervasive, it's longstanding, it's everlasting, it's ever present, it's omniscient. And we have to be really and truly the same way around our advocacy.
Thanks so much, Assembly Member. And I'm going to reframe the last question a bit. But I'm going to start with you, Assembly Member, then go to AJ and Zoe. Given everything that you just said, what gives you hope? And we can start with you, Assembly Member Walker.
Clean slate gives me hope, right? The fact that we just did that says that, the spigot is still open. And so there's still a lot more work that we need to do. We have second chance bills that still need to be passed. Of course, we also did wrongful convictions. We need to have a full-on restoration of voting rights. As the chair of the Committee on Election Law, we need to have the restoration of voting rights for people who are presently incarcerated as well. Though we have made some advances where people who at one point in time when they were on parole, they couldn't register to vote and vote, but now they can. And so it will say to government that out of sight is not out of mind, and we are activating a group of egregious voters who are coming back to the polls with a vengeance. And it's to ensure that while they may have been supported and helped in this instance, that there's so many more people who needs the level of support that they've been able to receive because now they're outside. And so again, and then there are a number of new elected officials who are getting elected on the city, state, and federal stage. That of course gives us a new sense of belonging and of understanding. Sometimes when we might get tired, they want to keep on going. And so we help them by giving them the tools that are necessary in order to keep the fight. One of my mentors said to me that it may have taken us, just a few years ago, over 400 years to achieve what we got, but it's going to take an eternity for us to protect. And we, again, are seeing that each and every day. And so while we know that the currency of government is the franchise, and we have to make sure that we are registering people to vote and making sure that they vote early and that they vote often, because again, what we saw was that we won on the policy, but we lost on the politics. And those two things work hand in hand. And we know that the fight is not over. We're seeing what's happening in Washington, D.C., right? And so there's going to be a huge power struggle that's going to go on, of course, in the next year's election cycle. And I believe 1000% that criminal justice reform will be on the menu. And so we have to make sure that we are continuing in this moment to lift up these true stories, to lift up the advances, to show that Zoe's work and watching these statistics and showing how the policies are being implemented and how effective they're being or ineffective. We have to show people how to utilize all of these databases so we can track and see who's getting bail and from where and what are the circumstances and by how many and by what race. And so that we ensuring that the tenets of all of the criminal justice reforms that we have passed and must continue to pass continue to reach its creed and its legacy in our country.
Thank you, Assembly Member Walker. AJ, so moving to you, the general gist is what gives you hope, but in particular, I think I started out the question around like the inside outside strategies and like different strategies that groups are starting to coalesce around or starting to employ in this fight around bail reform. I'd love to hear like what you all see the role of legal aid is in this fight around bail reform. And of course, what gives you hope?
Assemblywoman Walker gives me hope, and all of her colleagues who voted no on the budget every year and like take the hard moral stance. And also just the folks that are surrounded in this movement. I want to say like this movement was built by people who are the most impacted, right? And when we talk about narrative access and the stories that we ask, we're asking people to relive what by all accounts is always a traumatic experience. It's some of the worst moments of their lives. And when we're asking people to share success stories, we're asking people to talk about that experience too, even if it didn't end in a conviction. And there are so many amazing groups of impacted leaders and their family members who are just forever walking the halls of Albany, forever rallying outside of City Hall. We've got Vocal New York, in the city, Freedom Agenda up there, Center for Community Alternatives is across the state. And we wouldn't even be here if it weren't for all of those people who have taken the traumatic experiences that they've lived out or their family members have lived out with them and have turned it into action. So that will forever be a hope generator for me. I also hate that we have to keep calling on people to come back and defend something with their own life stories. And I hope that there's more moral courage that is built up by those that we elect to stop that from having to happen. I'll also say, I think as a defense attorney, as a public defender, I think that we'll always be around, to help to safeguard against any kind of small changes that will have big effects, and then to keep fighting in the courts. One of my colleagues in decarceration and in the trial office are doing one of these, can bail be set because of new arrest hearings today. So the fight never stops, and we'll keep litigating, we'll keep clawing our way back to something that includes more freedom. I also want to say we got to guard against the other kinds of creeps that seem like success, like something that we were really clear about in 2018, 2019 was we didn't want to expand electronic monitoring, for an example, right? Which is just detention by another name, and also is incredibly cost prohibitive. So there is electronic monitoring allowed, but the cost is not allayed to the person who's charged with the crime, right? Still a creep into that, right? Like detention is detention, no matter if it's an electronic bracelet monitoring every move or if you're incarcerated. So I also will say, as someone who has many times stood next to the wonderful social workers that staff the supervised release offices, this is a program that now operates here in the city with a $201 million budget and just got another almost $38 million in this city's budget. And yes, do we need services? Yes, we need them. But do we need to keep expanding them in the court? No. I'm going to go back to what Assemblywoman Walker talked about, which is community-based services, right? The Brownsville Safety Alliance, that's not something that was created in the arraignment parts in the court system. That's the community meeting its own needs and being empowered to do so. And I think that we have to keep encouraging us, like lawyers aren't going to save us, right? The courts aren't going to save us. And we have to always be vigilant against that creep, that ever expansion, which is really just another way of tying people to a system. And let's actually get services that aren't connected to whether or not you maybe miss court one day, and that social worker with supervised release has to notify the judge and have a warrant issued, right? That's not freedom. True freedom is having these services in the communities available to people who are not only available because you're arrested. And I just think that there's a lot of movement around that. There's a lot of cross movement building. I think this last year too, especially around the issues of the tendency to equate mental health challenges with criminal activity, which we have to fight against. But we are realizing that over half the Rikers population right now has a diagnosis, a severe mental illness diagnosis. That's not okay, right? That's not us doing our job as a society. So I think that kind of cross-pollination and understanding, like Assemblywoman Walker said, bail reform is not just those laws changing, it's creating those services, it's taking care of one another, and it's putting our budget priorities into public health initiatives, into housing initiatives. And that's what we have to keep fighting for. We have to reach across those kind of bucketed issue areas. We have to, pass things, yes, like clean slate. We have to end the lifetime ban on jury service for people with felony convictions. That's a bill that's pending as well, the Jury of Our Peers bill. We have to get our elders home from prisons. We have to pass these parole justice bills, right? Because when we talk about violence interruption, the people that are the most well-positioned to do so are our elders who have served decades upon decades of unnecessary, long, and excessive sentences in our prisons. And so that's all. That feels like a lot, very weighty, but the fact that we're cross-pollinating across those lines and understanding the interconnectedness of it all, that's where I find the hope and the fight.
Thanks so much, AJ. And Zoe, with a few minutes left, I'll let you take it home for us.
Thank you. I'd like to build on something that Assemblywoman Walker mentioned earlier, which was the Brownsville Alliance. And I think that is something that gives me hope to know that the things that we're fighting for are working. And that, we have the solutions, we know the solutions that will bring safety to our communities, and to know that these things are happening and are working, that I think does a lot to bring me hope. And I think also importantly, if we want this movement to endure and to see continued progress, we need to make sure that we're inspiring hope for others as well. And I think that is something that, we're doing a lot of in like the narrative work that we've started doing more of these past few years, going back to the point of getting into communities, doing more organizing, definitely needed. I think conversations that I've had with people, just watching over time, having these conversations, seeing how they're thinking about these issues change, that's also brings a lot of hope to me for this work. Just knowing that, if we can have these conversations with the community, share the correct information, and really tie the work that we're doing into this fight for safety and fairness, that we do see people, change how they might be viewing the system, and bring more people into the movement to join us in pushing for these solutions that we know are effective outside of our jails and policing, and bringing more access to services like housing, more programs like violence interrupters. And again, just, I think a lot of the times when we do talk about these things, it can feel so big and so unattainable. But again, just to know that these programs are happening already, they're working. What we're fighting for is not a pipe dream. And, we've seen the solutions that we're fighting for work to change the material conditions of the people who we're fighting for. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And with that, we probably have about 30 seconds left. So I want to thank everyone that was able to join us this afternoon. I especially want to thank our panelists, Assembly Member Latrice Walker, our champion for bail and criminal justice reform, just more broadly. Thank you so much for all of your hard work. AJ, thank you for continuing to fight the good fight in the courtroom. We know that it's not easy seeing this, debating and, being in these coalitions and then actually seeing this play out in the courtroom could not be easy at all. and Zoe for really keeping your ear to the ground on bail reform for all of these years and giving us the tools and resources that we need in order to convince some of Assemblymember Walker's more stubborn colleagues that they should do the right thing as well. This webinar has been recorded. And so if you want to go rewind back and listen to something, please let us know. Also, if any questions came up that you didn't get to ask, feel free to email us and we'll either pass them along to the panelists or we'll answer them ourselves. We'll also be sending out a few resources to go along with this discussion. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, everyone.